Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to Kotzen Hall. I'm Maria Georgopoulou. I'm the director of the Gennadios Library here at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And it is our distinct pleasure to see so many of you on the first Saturday of June. You didn't go to the beach, or you went and are back. So we're very happy to have you here. But I understand what the draw is, and we have three draws tonight. Lord Byron, of course, who is being commemorated here on the 200th anniversary of his death in Missolonghi, and two very distinguished guests, Roderick Beaton and Alicia Stallings, two people who have a lot to say about Byron, have thoughts about Byron, and I'm sure will help us understand and appreciate this poet. So at the Gennadios Library, and for the collection, the original collection of Ioannis Gennadios, who was a Greek and was ambassador in England in the late 19th and early 20th century, Lord Byron was, I think, one of these sort of giants. He was a Philhellene, he was a poet. He loved Greece, and he came to Greece to help in the Greek War of Independence, and he died in Greece. So obviously for Gennadios, this was a man who was, in fact, could impersonate and embody, not impersonate, embody what he felt the British should know and should feel about modern Greece. And I think this is why when in 1880 there was an auction of things that belonged to Lord Byron, Ioannis Gennadios was there to get quite a few of them. And then he got more things in 1893, and this is, in fact, a quite wonderful collection of memorabilia of Lord Byron's that are on display in the main reading room of the Gennadios Library, and where you can go after the end of our evening here to take a look. So without any further ado, I wanted to say two words on our distinguished speakers. We will start with Roderick Beaton, who is Emeritus Koraes Professor of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature. He grew up in Edinburgh, studied in Peterhouse, Cambridge, where he received a PhD in English literature, a degree in English literature and a PhD in modern Greek. And since 1981, he taught at King's College London, first as lecturer in modern Greek language and literature, and then from 1988 until his retirement a few years ago as Koraes Professor. And of course, Rodi is a person who has written on many, many topics from Byzantine literature, and this is the first book that I read as a graduate student, but also he moved on to give us so much more, not about Lord Byron, but also on the Greeks. He's a fellow of the British Academy, a commander of the Order of Honor of the Hellenic Republic, and in 2023 he received honorary citizenship of Greece. And I wanted to, and he's chair of the trustees of the British School at Athens, and I wanted to thank the director of the British School for plotting with us to keep him in Athens longer so that he could be with us this evening. If you don't mind, I'll talk about Alicia because I don't think I need to come back and forth up here. Alicia Stallings is the Oxford Professor of Poetry. She's from Georgia, where she studied classics, and then she also studied at Oxford University. She's a poet, and her collections include Like, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, Olives, which was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award, Hapax, and Archaic Smile, a winner of the Richard Wilbur Award, and finalist for both the Yale Younger Poets Series and the Walt Whitman Award. And her poems have appeared in the Best American Poetry anthologies of 1994, 2000, 2015, 2016, and 17. And she's also a person who speaks and writes about things in the Times Literary Supplement, and she's a contributor to poetry. Alicia lives in Athens, and when she's not in Oxford, and she is a wonderful interlocutor about many things from the classics to poetry. And her latest verse translation is the pseudo-Homeric The Battle Between the Frogs and the Mice, an illustrated edition with Paul Dry books, and her latest volume of poetry is a collection of selected poems, This Afterlife, and this came out in 2022. And she's the proud recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, where she has a Genius Award. So without further ado, I wanted to start to ask Roddy Beaton to come to the podium. They will give us small contributions, I mean, not small contributions, small in size, and then we will have time to open a discussion. Please.
It's all right, it's not the kind that turns cloudy when you put water in. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Maria, for those kind words of introduction. And Kalomina. It's a particular pleasure to be speaking here in Kotzen Hall, since as chair of the trustees of the Council of the British School at Athens, we are, of course, your neighbours. And I understand through our director, Rebecca, who's here, that we are very good neighbours. But it's very nice of you to invite me to be part of this celebration of Lord Byron, some of whose memorabilia, as many of you will have seen, are on exhibition next door in the library. It's also a particular pride and pleasure to me to be invited to share a platform with the Oxford Professor of Poetry. Professors, like me, are tenny penny these days, but the position of Oxford Professor of Poetry is literally unique in the world. So it's a very great pleasure to share a platform with Alicia Stallings, a poet and translator whose work I greatly admire, and, if I may add, just happens to be an extraordinarily nice person. Now that is something that no one would say about George Gordon, Lord Byron. The young George Gordon, future Lord Byron, was born on the 22nd of January, 1788. Just getting used to this thing. I've got it now, I hope. 22nd of January, 1788, in a house just off Oxford Street, round the corner from the John Lewis department store today. He died just along the coast in Missolonghi, aged just 36, 200 years ago this year, on the 19th of April, 1824. In between, Byron led a restless life of travels, celebrity, and scandal. He became the most influential and the most read poet of his age, not only in Britain, but in translation all over Europe. And near the end of his life, he gave up all of that to risk everything, and eventually to lose it, in a political cause, the cause of freedom for the people of Greece from Ottoman rule. In this brief talk, I'm going to take you through some of the highlights of Byron's remarkable life journey that took him all the way from London to Missolonghi and back, if not quite literally in a barrel of rum, as per my title, in a manner that you will hear. Not long after his first birthday, the young Byron's mother decamped with her infant son from London to her native Aberdeen. By far the longest period that Byron ever lived at the same address was from 1791 to 1798 in his mother's house in Aberdeen, and there he is on the screen. Many years later he would write, "But I am half a Scot by birth and bred a whole one." It was the unexpected death of a great-uncle in 1798, when he was 10, that catapulted the boy George Gordon into his new role as the 6th Baron Byron. Along with the title, Byron inherited the partly ruined former monastery in Nottinghamshire that had been the family home of his ancestors for several centuries. This was Newstead Abbey, and this is more or less how it looks today. Nowadays, it's a place of pilgrimage for admirers of the poet from all over the world. But he actually only lived there for no longer than a few months at a time, over a period of about 4 years. Instead, the adolescent Byron shared with his mother a series of more practical but less glamorous temporary homes in Nottinghamshire. And actually, the longest settled period during Byron's early life that he ever spent was 5 years as a boarder at the famous Harrow School outside London, from 1801 to 1805. After that came Trinity College, Cambridge, which he left after just 2 years without taking his degree at the end of 1807. Byron was just 21 years old when he set foot in Greece for the first time. The year was 1809, the month September. He had set out with his friend from Cambridge, the future Member of Parliament and travel writer John Cam Hobhouse. And they set out basically as what today we might call gap year tourists. But this at the time was known as the Grand Tour. And their way took them first to Portugal, Spain, and the British naval stations of Gibraltar on the Spanish mainland, and the island of Malta. After that, much the greater part of the trip was spent in the provinces of the Ottoman Empire that Europeans loosely called Greece, although at that time, of course, Greece didn't exist as an independent state. Byron's first encounter with the Greek world began at Preveza on the west coast, and then took him, there's not a dotted line, but you can see can I get the pointer to... Oh, pointer, yeah, he went all this way overland. Took him northwards into Epirus and today's Albania. And what excited Byron from the start was not the ancient ruins, but the exotic landscape. The scene was savage, but the scene was new, he would exclaim shortly afterwards. The grand tourists, the aristocrats, they always went, they were always in search of the ancient world, the roots of their civilization. The young Byron was excited by things that were the very opposite, new. That's a line from the poem that he began writing actually while he was on these travels, the poem that became known as Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. It was the primitive, the raw newness of this world that first caught the imagination of the 21-year-old Byron. And it was in the wilds of northwest Greece and Albania he exulted in being lost in a thunderstorm in the middle of the night in the vicinity of the monastery of Zitza. He was rescued from shipwreck by the famously rugged Suliots when he and Hobhouse were cast on their shore. He was simultaneously thrilled and horrified to be received by the man he called the Muslim Buonaparte, the fearsome Ali Pasha of Ioannina. It wasn't until December, still in 1809, that Byron for the first time came face to face with ancient Greece. The travellers came ashore at the tiny harbour and customs post on the site of the modern and also ancient port of Iter. From there, the ride through the forest of olive trees towards the ancient sanctuary of Delphi on the flank of Mount Parnassos impressed even the more prosaic Hobhouse as, I quote, very romantic. Byron, who had already begun writing Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in Ioannina a month before, translated his impressions at once into verse. O thou Parnassus, whom I now survey, not in the frenzy of a dreamer's eye, not in the fabled landscape of a lay, but soaring snow-clad through thy native sky in the wild pomp of mountain majesty. Well, Byron went there at the beginning of December. I took that photograph in late November, but the climate has changed a bit in 200 years. You do still get snow on the top of Parnassos, of course, and some people go skiing there. At the site of Delphi itself, there was little to see of the ancient ruins, which had not at that time been excavated. So it wasn't until Christmas Day in 1809 that Byron and Hobhouse reached Athens and had their first close encounter with the physical remains of Greek antiquity. And Byron was impressed, but not quite in the ways that you might expect. His attitude to ancient ruins was, shall we say, ambivalent. And I think it did matter, actually. We often forget this, but Byron was acutely conscious of the fact that he was severely lame in one foot. He couldn't, without considerable pain and discomfort and difficulty, walk any distance at all. When we think of Byron discovering Greece, we have to remember him discovering it from the back of a horse. He wasn't getting down and pouring about among the ruins in the way that so many other travellers to Greece loved to do. For the same reason, he wasn't digging them up and taking them home either. In these lands where the arts of civilization had once been born, he met Greeks, living Greeks, not voices from the past. And they told him about the hopes of a subject people for liberation from their Ottoman masters. In Athens, during the autumn and winter of 1810 to 11, Byron made his most serious attempts yet to come to grips with the political realities of the lands through which he was travelling. He was living by that time in the Capuchin monastery that used to occupy what is now Lysikratou Square in Plaka. He wrote up his ideas in a series of notes that would be published along with Childe Harold in 1812. But his conclusion, when you think of all that happened later, was perhaps surprisingly dismissive. This is Byron writing in 1811, published the following year. The Greeks will never be independent. They will never be sovereigns as heretofore, and God forbid that they ever should. To talk, as the Greeks themselves do, of their rising again to their pristine superiority would be ridiculous, as the rest of the world must resume its barbarism after reasserting the sovereignty of Greece. We must always remember that Byron had, above all, a sense of humour, a sense of the absurd. He enjoyed taking an idea to its logical extreme. If it was true, that Greece was the highest point of human civilization, what would become the rest of us if Greece were to be fully restored? He plays with the idea. Byron abandoned his youthful researches without finding the answer to these questions. He still had a long way to travel. After that came Byron's years of fame, as they've been known ever since, in London. His years as a Regency dandy. He frequented the houses of the great and good, slept with many of them, and the years, as a result, were years of celebrity and, yes, scandal. After the disastrous failure of his marriage to Annabella Milbank and the birth of their daughter, the future mathematician Ada Lovelace, Byron left England for the second time in April 1816. He travelled via Switzerland to Italy. There he would remain for the next 7 years, still constantly on the move, living first in Venice, then in Ravenna, Pisa, and finally Genoa. In Italy, Byron the poet found a new voice, and I think Alicia will be telling us something about that in a moment. His years in Italy saw the creation of his mock-epic masterpiece, Don Juan. At the same time, Byron the man toyed with the possibility of a new vocation, political commitment to a revolutionary cause. the romantic rebel was thinking of transforming himself into something rather subtly different, a political revolutionary, a rebel, if you like, with a cause. By the spring of 1823, he was beginning to think of a new departure. More often than not, this was linked in Byron's mind to revolutionary politics. In letters and conversations, he tossed off suggestions of possible future destinations: Spain, Greece, the United States, South America, or even Australia, known at the time as Van Diemen's Land. In the event, and for reasons that were not clear to friends or acquaintances at the time, and have puzzled biographers ever since, it was to be Greece. A revolution against the ruling Ottoman Empire had broken out here in March 1821. And until the spring of 1823, 2 whole years later, it must be said, Byron had made no public declaration about events in Greece. So far as we can tell, he had very little to say in private either. And this is all the more surprising, since during those 2 years, and indeed while the revolution lasted, it was the talk of the whole of Europe, and as far away as the United States of America. Greece and its people had been linked to Byron's name ever since the spectacular success of the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in 1812. Then, in March 1823, a group of liberal-minded members of Parliament in England came together to form the London Greek Committee. This was a pressure group in support of the Greeks. One of its very first acts was to invite Lord Byron to become a member and to lend his name to the cause. You can see there it was a pub, but it looks rather grander than a pub, doesn't it? Where they met out of hours to plot this British support for Greece. And I rather enjoy this slide because the site of that pub, or however you describe it, on Arundel Street, and it was just off the Strand in central London. It's a stone's throw from King's College London, where I spent almost 40 years of my life teaching modern Greek. And that's the original of one of the letters, the very first letters sent to Byron on behalf of the committee. Nobody expected him to do more than to lend his name to the cause. The committee's emissaries, sent to sound him out where he was living in Genoa, were taken completely by surprise when Byron immediately declared his intention of going to Greece in person. He would, he said, take an active part in the struggle. The Byron of 1823 in Genoa was a very different man from the author of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, who had had himself painted in the local costume that he'd bought in Ioannina at the age of 25. 10 years later, he presented a very different appearance. The line drawing by Alfred d'Orsay is apparently drawn from life in May of 1823 in Genoa. He had aged. The decision was taken in June 1823. He had a military uniform made and 3 ceremonial helmets for himself and his companions, in what passed at the time for Homeric style. Byron sailed from the port of Genoa on a ship specially chartered for the purpose on the 16th of July, 1823. On the way, he stopped off for 5 months in Kefalonia, in the Ionian Islands, which at the time were under British rule, therefore not part of the revolutionary struggle. There, Byron was close enough to the conflict to find out what was really going on over here on the mainland, but without, for the time being, committing himself to any of the rival factions among the Greek leadership. As soon as he'd acquired the knowledge that he needed and made his decision, he took ship once more. On the 5th of January 1824, he went ashore in Missolonghi, the principal town in western Greece, and at the time the headquarters of one of the most far-sighted political leaders of revolutionary Greece, Alexandros Mavrokordatos. I say far-sighted in a strictly metaphorical sense. Mavrokordatos, one of the least charismatic leaders of the revolution, there he is really sticks out like a sore thumb, the only person in the whole of revolutionary Greece who wore a Western frock coat right through the revolution. And I don't think he's wearing his glasses there, but he did actually suffer severely from myopia. But believe me, as a politician, he was as far-sighted as they come. Byron, by the time he arrived in Missolonghi, had developed a very modern understanding of the power of economics and the affairs of nations. He worked tirelessly alongside Mavrokordatos to secure funds and to develop the rudiments of an economic policy for Greece. Unfortunately, that policy also became the basis for what later became the bailouts or mnemonia, Greece's endemic, if you like, foreign indebtedness begins with Byron in Missolonghi in 1824. Diplomacy and recognition by foreign powers were going to be essential too, Byron was convinced. And in both these spheres, the name of the poet acted as a magnet. At the time when he died, the first instalment of a promised £800,000 sterling, worth something like 36 million in today's money, raised from private subscribers in London, was on its way to the Greek government. But then, after almost exactly 100 days, Byron died, tragically, accidentally, unheroically, of fever at Missolonghi on the 19th of April, 1824. This painting was made in 1826, and it shows how quickly afterwards the event became a romantic legend. The reality, of course, can have been nothing like this. Ever since then, Byron has been remembered in Greece as a hero. And the fact that the most famous Englishman of his day died in Greece in the service of the Greek cause undoubtedly did much to influence the current of opinion in Europe in favour of Greece. But while he was alive, Byron's true contribution to the independence of Greece, I believe, lay in helping to internationalise the Greek cause and to turn the local revolution in Greece into a turning point in what the historian Mark Mazower has called the making of modern Europe. Byron's body, to conclude, returned to England in May 1824, ironically enough, on the same ship that had brought out from London the first tranche of the loan that had been raised partly in his name to aid the Greek provisional government. As his biographer Fiona McCarthy describes it, I quote, "To preserve Byron's body for the voyage, holes had been bored through the layers of wood and tin, and the coffin set in a larger outer cask containing 180 gallons of spirits." There is the barrel of rum. In this manner, George Gordon Noel, as he was by that time known, Byron, returned to his starting point. In July 1824, huge crowds turned out to watch his funeral procession make its way through central London. On its way to his final resting place in Hucknall Church, in his ancestral Nottinghamshire, Byron's cortege passed along Oxford Street, along past today's John Lewis department store, close to the spot where he had been born 36 and a half years before. And with that, I thank you, and I will hand over seamlessly to Alicia Stallings.
It's a great honor to be here and to be sharing the stage with Roddy, who is a real professor. I am an elected professor. Again, it is a unique position. I like to explain it. It's a combination of pure democracy, so people vote for this, but also absolute elitism. You have to have a degree from Oxford. So it's and not an honorary degree. Those don't count. But so in that way, it's a little bit like 5th century Athens, I like to say. Except, women. So it was wonderful to have that overview of Byron's life, and I learned a few things. I'm going to do the opposite, so that was kind of the macro view, and I'm going to do a super focused look at one poem, and I do have a poem of my own. If there's time, I'll read that, which is about Byron's helmet. So this is one of his most famous poems, The Isles of Greece. It is often anthologized as a standalone poem, but in fact, as probably most of this audience knows, it's embedded within his masterpiece, Don Juan, and it's set in an episode which I like to call Don Juan. I like to call this one Romeo and Heidi, the pirate's daughter. So Don Juan, who is a shipwrecked Spanish sailor, ends up on an unnamed Cycladic island, is rescued by the pirate's daughter Heidi, and while their father, Lambros the pirate, is away, they become lovers, and it's rumored that he has died, and they have a big party, which to me feels like a wedding banquet, even though Byron is very iffy about whether he considers them married or not. But in the middle of this, there is a poet, a Greek poet that Byron specifically refers to as a modern Greek, and he delivers this poem. These are the first few stanzas. And we'll go into, so there's a lot of context to the poem. He makes it very clear that the poet himself is somewhat of an unreliable narrator, so there's a lot of contextualizing of this very famous poem. But we'll look first at the poem itself. These are the first 4 stanzas, which I think everyone, these are the ones I think that are most well-known, and certainly by far the most well-known in Greece. The Isles of Greece, the Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung, where grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phoebus sprung, eternal summer gilds them yet, but all except their sun is set. The Scion and the Tian muse, the hero's harp, the lover's lute, have found the fame your shores refuse. Their place of birth alone is mute to sounds that echo farther west than your sire's islands of the blessed. The mountains, okay, we think we have to do this one together. The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. And musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free. For standing on the Persian's grave, I could not deem myself a slave. This is the most famous stanza of this poem, so it gets decontextualized even within that. A king sate on the rocky brow, which looks o'er sea-born Salamis, and ships by thousands lay below, and men and nations all were his. He counted them at break of day. And when the sun set, where were they? So these stanzas in particular are the best known. I think there's a very good point to be made with this versus the rest of the poem, that this is an earlier, at least these first 4 stanzas are written much earlier. Roddy, in his wonderful book, on Byron's War, points out that modern editors and commenters do not take seriously the evidence of Thomas Medwin, who is Shelley's cousin, who reported 2 separate conversations with Byron not long after these cantos of Don Juan had been published in 1821, in which he claimed that the Isles of Greece had been written years before, at the same time as the second canto of Childe Harold. So the second canto of Childe Harold is written while Byron is, or started at least while Byron is in Athens, and staying, on Byron Street, not yet named Byron Street. And he has visited Marathon, and he has visited Salamis and Sunio, or looked at these things. In fact, he has been offered the sale of the entire plain of Marathon for sort of pennies. I don't know why he didn't buy the whole plain of Marathon, what he could have done. But there's a personal, one feels this could be Byron speaking. There's a sense that this maybe is not the Greek poet that we hear about in Don Juan. So the canto in which this is written is finished, I think, in November of 1819. It's published, I think, in August of 1821. So this, though, has a feeling of being a younger Byron. Oops, I'll put the stanzas 5 through 8. Because there's a sudden shift here. And where are they, and where art thou, my country? I don't think Byron can refer to Greece as my country. There's a sense, I think, where there's a shift of point of view if we take that these early stanzas are, written years and years before. This now is this character who is speaking or singing, entertaining at this wedding. My country, on thy voiceless shore, the heroic lay is tuneless now, the heroic bosom beats no more, and must thy lyre so long divine degenerate into hands like mine. Degenerate is one of these words that gets tossed about when talking about modern Greece or modern Greeks. Are the modern Greeks, have they degenerated from some pristine, heroic, Periclean Greek ideal? That's one of the ways that modern Greek can be used. So degenerate seems to be the voice of the modern Greek. Something in the dearth of fame, though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot shame, even as I sing suffuse my face. For what is left the poet here? For Greeks a blush, for Greece a tear. Again, this cannot really be in the voice of Byron. It has to be in the voice of a modern Greek poet. We might think now, what would happen if I were a contemporary modern Greek poet reading this in 1821? How would I feel seeing this voiced? We get this weird idea of, exhuming the dead of Sparta to come and create a new Thermopylae. I do always point out that the Greeks lost at Thermopylae because there's just a lot of rhetoric out there that suggests it was a glorious victory. It was a very important delaying operation, but sorry for the right-wing parties of the world, they did not win that. So what silence still and silent all know the voices of the dead sound like a distant torrent's fall and answer, let one living head but one arise, we come, 'tis but the living who are dumb. I'm going to go back to that. Now we have another shift. We suddenly have the mention of Suli and Parga. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine on Suli's rocks. And I love that we had that image from Lear of what Suli rock looks like. And Parga's shore exists the remnant of a line such as the Doric mothers bore, and there perhaps some seed is sown the Heraclitan blood might own. Trust not for freedom to the Franks. They have a king who buys and sells, and native swords and native ranks. The only hope of courage dwells, but Turkish force and Latin fraud would break your shield, however broad. So if the very beginning of the poem we might think is possibly written in 1809, it has the feel of Byron himself speaking, this also marks the date of the poem. Obviously, Byron had contact with the Suliots in 1809. He's nearly shipwrecked, and they sort of save him, and this is part of this romantic idea of being saved by bandits, and he has a wonderful description of this in Childe Harold. But Parga, although Parga also gets mentioned in Childe Harold, in a line when the next stanza is talking about Franks who have a king who buys and sells, dates this pretty accurately. Suli's rock also, I think, at this point is referring in some ways to the war with Ali Pasha and the Suliots in 1803. Probably most famous in kind of folklore and folk song for the dance of Zolongo, where in theory 50 women and their infants dance to the edge of a cliff, and the women throw the infants over to their death and then dance off the edge of the cliff in the dance known as a soros, I think. So this is like all over Europe in terms of paintings. Here's some, women having flung themselves with their children. We have another version of the dance of Zolongo. But Parga in particular it's on the mainland, but it was part of the Ionian island group, which was for a while under the English and was known as the United States of the Ionian Islands. But I think in 1816, the English sell Parga to Ali Pasha. So Parga has been part of this Greek, somewhat Albanian, but also Greek-speaking part of the larger Hellenic world that has never been under the Ottoman yoke. Ali Pasha has had his eye on it for years and years and years, and suddenly it just gets sold. So we have a sense of exactly when this happens. There is a letter in the Edinburgh Review, which we know that Byron is fond of reading, from the Ionian-born Italian poet Ugo Foscolo. So in 1819, the British sold off Parga to the notorious Ali Pasha. Parga had never fallen under the Ottoman yoke. It had been under the Venetians, the French, but long desired by Ali Pasha. So Ionian-born Italian poet Ugo Foscolo, who is known to Byron and is also known to an Ionian poet, Dionysius Solomos, wrote a scathing essay about this English betrayal in the Edinburgh Review of October of 1819. This canto gets published in, I think, is finished in November of 1819. So this really quite marks that the end point of the poem is right before it is published. Like with the Dance of Zalongo, this becomes a very romanticized incident because the residents of Parga, again, sort of do this liberty or death thing. They say, we would rather be dead than be under Ali Pasha. They threaten a kind of mass suicide. The English are horrified and embarrassed and send ships to take them to Corfu, I think it is. But in the meantime, the Pargats exhume the bodies of all of their ancestors and burn them. So they do this cremation. This is one where the bones of the ancestors are literally exhumed towards the liberty of the future and burned on the shore. And this is also something that is highly romanticized in poems in Europe and in paintings. So these are the exiles of Parga. So there's some of the strange things that are happening in the poem, but let's look at the end of the poem. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine. I'm going to go back to that. To fill the bowl with wine is a kind of standard way to, in English poetry to describe drinking a lot of wine. But Byron had actually witnessed people using bowls rather than cups to drink wine. Let's see if I can find my... So these are tassia. They were part of the kit of every Greek soldier. They were often highly decorated. His Suliot soldiers would have had these. So I think in some ways maybe the bowl of wine is quite literal. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, stanza 15. Our virgins dance beneath the shade. I see their glorious black eyes shine, but gazing on each glowing maid, my own, the burning teardrop laves to think such breasts must suckle slaves. It's a very pretty stanza and reflects an earlier stanza where we have another description of the chorus of Greek girls waving their white handkerchiefs and strung like a string of pearls and so on. But again, so close to the mention of Suli, you have to think that the implication is instead of suckling slaves, these women should dance off a cliff and kill their infants. I mean, if they are really going to be part of the freedom, there's a way in which these virgins are compared, I think, implicitly with the women of Zalongo. Then there's this last stanza. I think it is the weakest, maybe, stanza of the poem. I don't think it's a great stanza. Place me on Sunium's marbled steep, where nothing save the waves and I may hear our mutual murmurs sweep. They're swan-like, let me sing and die. A land of slaves shall never be mine, dash down yon cup of Samian wine. There's that wonderful idea of maybe dashing down. We're not going to be drunk any longer. We're going to sober up and we're going to fight for freedom. But I think also here it's Byron saying, I think I need to connect back to the beginning of the poem where I've had Marathon and I've had Salamis, and I remember my visit to Sunio where I have literally carved my name into the temple. So what happens though? Again, I'm sort of intrigued about what would happen if you are a Greek poet around the same time who is reading this criticism in the voice of a very jaded and cynical modern Greek poet. And, we do have this case of Dionysius Solomos. So this other poet, exactly 10 years younger than Byron, born in 1709 on Zakynthos of a count and his maid, enters the story. He's of Venetian patrician blood. They were refugees from Crete. But he's educated in Italy and exclusively in Italian. So he even writes to his illiterate Greek mother in Italian. I'm not sure how that worked. He wrote and published all of his early poems in Italian and returned to Zakynthos in 1818. So we might again remember that Canto 3 will have at least been finished in 1819, and all of these are going to appear in 1821. So imagine a Greek poet reading the Isles of Greece and the description of the poor trimmer of a Greek poet in 1819, right before the Greek War of Independence breaks out, or in August of 1821, which is when this is actually published, when the revolution has begun. So Byron writes the Isles of Greece before the revolution is really underway, but it's published after it has officially been started. In 1822, Solomos had an encounter with Spiridon Trikoupis, the poet and statesman who incidentally would deliver Byron's funeral oration in Missolonghi and who would become the new nation's first prime minister. And Spiridon, on hearing Solomos' Italian poetry, is supposed to have said, "Your aptitude reserves you for a place on the Italian Parnassus, but the first places there are already taken. The Greek Parnassus does not yet have its Dante." So can you imagine being a young poet and be like, all of this could be yours. You could be the Greek Dante. In the end, he doesn't quite get there. But Solomos demurred because his Greek was really not fluent enough, he felt. And Trikoupis started him on a course of study with a focus on the Demotic language. That's also, I think, something that's very attractive about Byron, is he's really writing in Don Juan in a vernacular, and he's kind of giving this way of writing about every possible thing, so that this poem appears in a longer ottava rima thing that almost represents prose. And so there's this kind of exciting thing going on. Byron is also looking at Greek folk songs, revolutionary hymns, and Cretan Renaissance works, and so is Solomos. The only poem that Solomos completes in his lifetime is also his first poem, the Hymn to Liberty, which was written in May of 1823 and published in Missolonghi in 1824. It's possible there was some sort of very brief overlap with him and Byron, I don't know. Possibly on the very printing press that Byron brings with him to Missolonghi from Stanhope. And we'll notice here we have some of the first parts of this, which becomes our Greek national anthem. But if you go deeper into the poem, and it's 158 stanzas, you get to around stanza 83, we have this curious incident where Solomos directly engages with Byron. This is interesting to me. I don't think that the Isles of Greece has been translated at this point into Italian or into Greek. It's clear that he has read not just the Isles of Greece, but the context of the Isles of Greece, because one of the things that we learn about the modern Greek poet is he's like Pindar. If Pindar sang horse races, what should hinder himself from being pliable as Pindar? It's one of the things we learn, that this poet will sing whatever is required for the occasion. And he specifically compares himself to Pindar, but it's as though he is in the scene where we have the Greek poet remarking on the beautiful girls whose breasts will suckle slaves. He not only engages with it, but he flips it. So, this is a very rough translation, but in the shade, hand in hand, in the shade, I also see, kego blepo, I'm also looking, blepo kego, where they do their dance. In the dance, they sweetly turn their lovely erotic eyes, and the dark breezes toss their all gold hair. My soul rejoices how the breast of each girl, sweet bosomed, readies the milk of courage and freedom. These girls are not going to suckle slaves, but not because they're going to fling themselves over a cliff, but because at this point the revolution is underway. Among the grass and the flowers, I do not raise my cup. I am not lifting up the bowl of Samian wine. I am sober now. Freedom-loving songs like Pindar I sing out. Byron's Pindar will sing whatever. He'll sing horse races. But I'm a Pindar who's going to sing the freedom-loving songs. And, risen, and it's interesting because the chorus, as it were, becomes the thing that he sings out like Pindar. So he's almost singing the chorus of his own song, risen from the holy bones of the Greeks, and with the courage of old days, hail, oh hail, liberty. So I do love the way that Byron's poem becomes the seed for essentially what is the Greek national anthem. So the hymn to liberty comes directly out of the Isles of Greece. The goddess freedom, as it were, at least in its first stanzas, is nestled within Byron. I think Byron would be very tickled about that. This is the hymn to freedom as it is published in Missolonghi. Notice that we have an epigraph from Dante. Again, that kind of nod to Dante. I believe he changes this very slightly. This, I think, is the remains of the actual printing press that was in Missolonghi. Obviously, not a lot from Missolonghi survives. This is how it is set to music. I got to see this in Corfu. This is the Isles of Greece when it's first translated into Greek, as far as I know, and I like how it has been nativized, so it's been turned into kind of native 15er meter. Rudyard Kipling's very beautiful translation. I personally think this is related to all of that, but I've gone to my time. I also have a poem about Byron's helmet, but maybe there'll be time for that later. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you both for two very different and very complementary ways in which you brought to us different facets of Lord Byron's. I think what we do want to do is maybe close with your poem, but if there are any questions, maybe take questions. I mean, I don't know what you want. Do you want to read your poem now? Yes, I think this is what we want.
We must hear the poem.
Okay. Well, I noticed that when the picture of Byron's helmet came up, people laughed. What's with that? It's not cool. Anyway, I was recently actually at events observing the Byron 200th anniversary at Trinity College in Cambridge. And one of the things that was asked is to come up with an original poem, and I was very concerned about that. That's when I came to Maria and said, I think I need to see some physical objects. And I'd gone to see the helmet. It was not in the museum because it's in Missolonghi. And I got to see the death wreath and some other things. But also Maria very kindly pulled out a very slim volume called Byron's Helmet. And in the end, it was this slim volume that kind of gave me my material. The stanzas are in ottava rima, which is the stanza form that Byron is using for Don Juan, and I've tried to get in some of those really silly Byronic rhymes. You'll see what I'm saying. Helmets, this is called Byron's Helmet. Helmets so fine were never meant to hack, so Mary Shelley said, and so begins 2 centuries of snark, not holding back. That Byron committed with his other sins a vainglory of headgear, gold and black and plumed with horsehair, fit for a Trojan prince like Hector, say, who put his helmet down because it made his frightened baby frown. A scene out of the Iliad so tender, everyone who reads it comes to tears. It is the family life it seems to render, and how the parents laugh at infant fears. The reader knows it is no happy ender. So it's no spoiler if I mention spears, soon put an end to Hector's ministrations, the scenes for irony and dissertations. But I digress. We're talking of the gear that Byron had designed and he brought with him to Greece. There was no slogan for Greek beer inviting him to come and live your myth. Whim or fate, he would be dead within the year before he'd even got into a rhythm, and not in battle, though he had an exceeding aversion to all quacks, leeches, and bleeding. The helmet then, perhaps too fine for use, never had a musket ball whiz by it, and yet its finery was not obtuse, intended to impress among the riot of hats there in the East, hypotenuse of smart triangulation. You might buy it within its context. What the helmet says is, I'm here among the headscarves and the fezzes. You only have to go to the museum where portraits of the heroes hang, a passel of chieftains and tough customers. You see them glowering down in red hats with a tassel and huge mustachios, a mausoleum to fighters whom you wouldn't want to wrestle. Few wear a top hat, as the London urban, but many rock a saber and a turban. And even here there is a helm Homeric that puts poor Byron's helmet in the shade, which shows that his design's not esoteric, the other's scarlet and with golden braid, yet no one has suggested it's barbaric or that it's less for use than for parade. This splendid helmet any Greek would own is the one once worn by General Kolokotronis. The museum holds some objects more exquisite and many items worthwhile to be seen, and yet the last time that I went to visit, no Byron's helmet perched in the vitrine. I asked of a museum guard, where is it? At first, he did not know what I could mean. But after something of a dance and song, he explained it was on loan to Missolonghi. Let's travel there to 1824. It's April, cruelest month. A thunderstorm, as if the world is shaken to the core, rattles the roof. And there lies a pale form, pale from the bleeding. It can bleed no more, and still, if you should touch it, slightly warm, and soon it will be lying underneath a pall on which are helmet, sword, and wreath. Dear reader, though, if you're a Byron boffin, you'll know his body stayed not in this land. He was not to be interred inside this coffin, but shipped to England in a vat of brandy. I may have to correct that. A preservative of spirits that has often pickled the person of many a Regency dandy. But in a Grecian urn lay the afflatus of poetry, his breathing apparatus. Fast forward a few months, if you'll allow. A Philhellene from Boston will arrive, a young physician, Samuel Gridley Howe. Too late to meet his hero still alive. The war is going gangbusters by now. He joins the Greeks and helps the cause to thrive as doctor and as fighter. Later on, he purchases the helmet from Trelawney. Perhaps you find this narrative quite fiddly, and maybe you suspect that this is filler. I tell you, though, that it was Samuel Gridley who bought the helmet and Jonathan Miller who bought the sword. Perhaps the sum was piddly. Trelawney, though, more charlatan than killer, probably fleeced them, taunting, "Don't you want her?" The sword went to Vermont with the Vermonter, where it still is. And Samuel takes the helmet back to Boston, where for 100 years it is displayed with other souvenirs that were not lost on the journey back from Greece. The horse hairs fade and then fall out, that once perhaps had tossed on the crest, a prop for children when they played as at Greeks and Trojans. Byron's head was small, so it fit on a girl's head, if at all. And in the helmet's presence, much was said about another war to finish slavery, for slavery, it turns out, was not dead here in this other land, and no more savory. Again, for liberty, much blood was shed. Nobody's made immortal by their bravery. And Mrs. Howe, though it's another story, wrote the words, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord," the battle hymn of the Republic. Perhaps the helmet heard her right. She fought for women's rights, vel sim, as she worked out the lyrics word for word. Okay, a helmet cannot hear. Its brim does not have ears. I know that it's absurd, personifying hats. And yet, the gists, it lived among such abolitionists. Fast forward now to 1926, inherited by Maud Howe Elliott, a daughter of the Howes, the helmet sticks as family heirloom and nothing she would sell yet. Maud, writer, suffragette, thinks up a fix, return the thing, and Pacey, Mary Shelley it, travels in high style, as you might guess, smart hatbox on the Orient Express. Arriving in Salonika, she sees the ragged families living in tents. These are the Asia Minor refugees from 1922, the evidence that war and suffering will never cease, however much we pray that war lends. Her father Samuel worked with such as these, providing tirelessly for refugees. In Athens, she's told too, there is a welter of wretched people, homeless, shoeless, solemn. The population's doubled, helter-skelter. Folks hang their laundry on a broken column. Boxes in the opera house are shelter for lucky ones, if luck did ever befall 'em. New neighborhoods rise up. And you could learn a lot from their names, New Ionia, New Smyrna. But let me now stop wrapping up my sermon. Much has happened since to that young nation, the trials and tribulations that determine a people's fate. For instance, occupation that, did I mention, by the way, was German. Famine and civil war in the generation of my mother-in-law, who, if she had kept journals, would have filled them up with warlords, tanks, and colonels. And there were lots of riots, for people, if you rile them, tend to get touchy. Austerity won't please them. The Greeks are good at protest as a phylum, and so it's generally best if you don't tease them. And now new people come to seek asylum if they don't drown or Frontex doesn't seize them from Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Palestine, wherever there is pain. The helmet has seen this and more. Because a poet, I can personify a helmet. It isn't just some top hat from the plaza or baseball cap from some hail fellow well met. It broods now on Odessa and on Gaza. It's seen so much, not much would overwhelm it. War and peace, lagoons, seas, ocean waters, its crowned great poets and American daughters.
I'm not sure. I think we should end here. And if there are any burning questions, maybe bring them into the Gennadius Library around the relics of Lord Byron and ask our two speakers, unless there is really a burning question. No? So, there is a question down there. Can you come forward, because I don't know when the microphone will come to you? And very brief, please.
Thank you very much for your interesting speeches. I'd just like to ask a quick question. How happy would Byron be with, he never saw Greece independent, with the independent Greece that came a few years later? Is it close or far away from the Greece that he envisaged through his letters and his poems? It's a question for both speakers, and thank you again.
I think he'd have found all the things that are wrong with it first, just as he did with everything else. But sto kato kato, as we say in Greece, at the end of the day, the Greece that was recognized by international treaty in 1830 and that has developed ever since from then is remarkably like the Greece that was really first imagined by Mavrokordatos and many of the other political leaders of the creators of the 1822 Constitution, the people that Byron worked with. And I think Byron seriously considered ideas about politics and how to create a modern nation did actually find their way into the Greece that we know and love today.
I don't have much to add.
Okay.
Where is Byron's heart?
I don't know.
Certainly where some of the organs ended up in an urn in Missolonghi, but I think are now lost with the Exodus. But where his metaphorical heart is, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, does it matter? But Shelley's heart was taken out of the fire that his remains were burnt on, and they were still there on the desk of his son some 50 years later, and apparently it was a sort of horrible, shriveled thing, and it crumbled into dust around about 1880, if you really want to know.
Thank you, both excellent talks. This is just a follow-up question for Professor Beaton from an interview that he gave. It was on actually the Airplane magazine about the possibility of Shelley the death of Shelley inspiring Byron to go out as a hero, to go to Greece. I mean, he, like you said, he didn't show too much interest in Greece, and then Shelley died, and Shelley wrote Hellas and that sort of thing. If you could maybe elaborate on that and talk about that.
Well, thanks for that. I was rather surprised to be interviewed for the Blue magazine for Aegean, and I never actually saw that interview. But anyway, nice to know that you read it. No, I think it actually is a serious point. Shelley, in a way, was everything that Byron wasn't, and the two of them were almost the same age. They were close friends, but a sort of difficult, quite complex relationship. And there was a rivalry as well. But Shelley was the idealist. Shelley was the one, the admirer of ancient Greece, pure and simple. And Shelley was, he was sort of young, he was handsome, he wasn't lame as Byron was. And I think Byron, the sort of cynical, slightly world-weary, very self-aware, very self-critical actually, looked at Shelley and saw a kind of image of himself as in some frames of mind, perhaps he'd actually like to be. And then suddenly, on the 8th of July, 1822, Shelley is lost at sea. He's drowned. And hence that horrible story I told you about his heart after the cremation. The fact that Shelley died so young, and that Shelley, there are quite a lot of indications, Shelley had been urging Byron to make a stand, to become involved in the cause of Greek independence. Now, Shelley was never a man of action. He was an idealist. Shelley would not have himself have been able to take up arms for Greece. But I think Shelley sincerely believed that Byron could. And when Shelley died, Byron, I think, was kind of inspired. He felt it as a duty to take on himself something of his dead friend and fellow poet. So Byron, if you like, kind of absorbed into himself something of the idealist and the classicist Shelley, things that he naturally was not, and deliberately transformed himself into the statesman that I believe he became when he arrived here in Greece. Thank you for the question and giving me the chance to try to explain that, I hope in a few words.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, why do you think Byron continues to have such a strong hold on the English cultural imagination? Has it got to do with the way that he, as a romantic poet, sort of set the stage for his own legacy with this intense preoccupation with the self? Or could it be, could the fascination have to do with a cultural need that we have today? And if so, does that mean that Byron's interest in Byron has more to do with us than with Byron himself?
Well, I'll answer this briefly, but I think Roddy probably has other things. Okay. Well, I'm sort of surprised to hear someone say that he does have such a hold on the English imagination, because I think in a way he does as a personality, but I don't think he's that widely read. So, the idea that he's mad, bad, and dangerous to know, which I think is Lady Caroline Lamb projecting, that gets caught up with things, and people are very obsessed with his personal life and so on. And in a way, we're missing such a big piece of that with the memoir having been burned, that we don't get his side of many of these stories. To me, I think his personality and his life story, there are always new biographies and so on, do, I think, interest people just because there's, scandal and these things. But I think for the rest of the world who are not as interested in his scandalous sex life, and they're very interested in him as more of a activist poet or whatever, and where I think he's better read. He's really important for, Pushkin and all of these vital authors. Whereas I think I would be hard pressed to say what poets immediately descend from Byron in English. So that's my very mixed answer.
Well, if not you, Alicia, but if I might, I mean, I think. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think one thing I feel I've sort of learned from the anniversary so far, and I hope that maybe we can all learn something from it by the time the anniversary is over, is that actually, when Byron is commemorated in Greece and in Britain, it's a very partial version of Byron in each case. Here, it's the national hero, and only. The poems are not all translated. A lot of Byron is not translated. His wonderful 12 volumes of letters are not available in Greek translation. They never have been. That's a challenge for someone here, perhaps. Whereas in Britain, it's all about celebrity, scandal, as Alicia said. And I think people in Britain don't realise that this was a Brit who in the last months of his life actually played an important part in shaping the history of Europe. And we don't realise that in Britain. So I'd like to see the Brits understanding more of the importance of Byron's role here in Greece. And I would also wish to see Byron actually appreciated in Greece in all his many dimensions, including the scandalous, but the most important to me would be the poetry, which is not very much known, sadly, here in Greece. And I really do recommend to you Byron's letters.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Both of you, and we wanted to ask, and there was a question on Zoom, if we can read your poem somewhere, or when will we be able to read it?
It's unpublished as now, but I think that Trinity Cambridge is going to bring out a volume of the original poems that were written for the event. So.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And so if you want to go to the Gennadios Library, I mean, you just go to the right, the door will be open, and you can go into the library for, 15 minutes to take a look at the memorabilia of Byron's.